Okay, so this video is dedicated to a Hmong friend of mine. And just a couple weeks ago, I knew absolutely nothing about Hmong culture. I just knew they were hill people who were originated from Laos and Thailand. But I'm still pretty ignorant on the issue now, on Hmong history now, but a little bit less ignorant than I was a week or two ago. Um, so I just wanted to share a few of the tidbits that I learned. Um, yeah, I'm gonna say a lot in this video, but or too, but go ahead and get it out of the way. So to understand Hmong immigration, you have to understand the Vietnam War and the conflict between North and South Vietnam. But to understand that, you have to note that the entire area that's now composed of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was under French control since I want to say like the 1890s, and Laos was actually the last to be absorbed as a protectorate by the French in 1893. But anyway, I'll get to the nitty gritty of the Vietnam War in a future video. But at a very high level, the Lao people fled from China. I want to say southern China to Laos, escaping persecution, and they either fled directly to the hills of Laos, or they fled to the lowlands and then to the hills to escape persecution that they perhaps were facing when they lived in the lowlands of Laos. But in the early 1950s, in 1940, let's rewind back a little bit. So like I was saying, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were under French control since the 1890s, and in 1941, World War II, Japan invaded that whole region, which at the time was referred to as French Indochina, and took control of the area. When Japan surrendered from World War II in 1945, the French once again assumed control. 1946 to 54 was the first Indochina War, and I want to say that was largely between the Viet Minh and the French. And Viet Minh were a communist party who were directed toward getting independence for Vietnam. And I'm not sure whether they were also fighting on behalf of Laos and Cambodia, but at that time they were in Vietnam, which itself was actually divided into three separate regions. I think they're called Annam, Tonkin, and Cochin China. And in the southern portion of the region around Saigon, you had people who were sympathetic to the French. And in the northern portion, you had the Viet Minh, who were at the time led by Ho Chi Minh, who's the namesake of Ho Chi Minh City. But the Viet Minh ended up winning over the French, and Vietnam gained its independence. But in the middle of that war, Laos actually gained independence from the French in 1953. And shortly after that, the Vietnam War began between the communist North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And where Laos comes in was the North Vietnam, communist North Vietnam had a guerrilla faction in South Vietnam called the Viet Cong, and they were sending supplies to the Viet Cong through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that trail largely passed through Laos. And the U.S. was fighting on the side of South Vietnam, and there's a group that came into power around that time, the Pathet Lao in Laos, that was fighting on behalf of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. And the United States actually, they're officially fighting a war in Vietnam, but they were secretly attacking the Ho Chi Minh Trail as well, and they they were using troops of men from Laos, men and women. I'm assuming perhaps it was only men who fought, and they used the Hmong to fight on their behalf against North Vietnamese troops as well as the Viet Cong. And it was under the pretext that if the U.S. lost the war, then the U.S. would grant the Hmong refuge, and they did. And the Hmong were led by General Vang Pao, and forgive me if I'm butchering that name. And the U.S. ended up losing the war, and North Vietnam took control of South Vietnam in 1975, or was it 73, 75? I think the war officially ended in 75. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973. I'm not looking at any notes right now. This is off the top of my head, so I might have the dates wrong. Oh, forgive me if I'm wrong, and feel free to correct me. But yeah, I think after the U.S. lost the war, many Hmong actually fled across the Mekong River into Thailand, but there were some others who came to the U.S. Vang Pao and veterans who fought on behalf of the U.S. troops in Laos, and that war was actually, the war in Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was actually a secret war. It wasn't released to the U.S. public until later. It leaked to the American public via Pentagon Papers, and so the U.S. or the Hmong ended up, the ones who didn't take refuge in Thailand ended up settling in the United States. And now the question comes, why did they settle mostly in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Central California? And I think the answer that I found was the Lutheran Church was largely concentrated in those areas, or was most prevalent in those areas in Wisconsin, Central California, and the Twin Cities, and the Lutheran Church was responsible for sponsoring many of the Hmong. But on top of that, what's interesting is they didn't follow the typical immigration path of immigrants to the U.S. who go directly to big cities like New York, L.A., San Francisco, the typical immigrant gateways. I think a lot of that was because the Hmong in Laos were subsistence farmers, and they were used to living an entirely self-sufficient life as farmers, supporting growing food for their family, and Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Central California all had a substantial agrarian base, and perhaps that, in addition to the Lutheran Church sponsorship, was a big driving force behind the 1970s Hmong immigration wave to those areas. And I know later waves of Hmong immigration to the U.S. were largely driven by family reunification programs. So pretty much the Hmong went to where they had relatives, which was pretty much in the areas in which they'd initially emigrated to, or I guess they emigrated from Laos and immigrated to the United States. But yeah, I think that briefly addresses the driving force behind Hmong immigration in the United States. So they fought on behalf of the CIA-directed troops led by General Vang Pao in the secret war in Laos, attacking the Ho Chi Minh, the supply routes between North Vietnam and the Viet Cong guerrillas in South Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the bulk of which passed through Laos, or a large portion of which passed through Laos. And in exchange for that, they were granted refuge in the United States. So those that didn't cross the Mekong River into Thailand came to the U.S. And they settled where they settled in the U.S., I think largely because of both the agricultural heritage in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Central California, as well as Lutheran Church sponsorship. If there are other driving forces, feel free to let me know. And I do know shortly after that, a lot of them moved into St. Paul, Minnesota. And I was reading actually a lot of in the early 1980s, a lot of the public housing, in St. Paul, Minnesota was, I want to say like 50 to 70% comprised of Hmong refugees. That was pretty interesting. Anyway, I'll probably add another video getting into some of the details of the Vietnam War and focusing more on Vietnam rather than on Laos. But again, they were both part of French Indochina, so I guess they're connected in a way. But one question I have is the First Indochina War ended in 1954, but Laos gained independence in 1953, which was, supposedly during the war. How did that work? Vietnam only gained independence in 54, and I thought they were all controlled by the French. Well, perhaps if you have any insight into that, feel free to let me know. All right.